November 8th, 1944. A muddy field outside the French village of Singling in the Lorraine, a Sherman tank named Cobra King sits at the end of a long scar of churned earth, smoke still drifting from the engine deck. The tank has been hit. Its commander has been wounded. Its crew has bailed out into a ditch 50 meters away, dragging their loader by his collar. By every measure that matters in November 1944, Cobra King is finished. A casualty, a statistic, a line item on a combat loss report that a young ordnance lieutenant named Belton Cooper will deliver tonight, hand-carried by jeep through 50 miles of half-cleared countryside, because the information is too sensitive to put on the radio. 48 days later, on the afternoon of December 26, 1944, the same Sherman tank, same hull, same casting numbers stamped into the steel, same radial engine, rolls through artillery fire into the southern perimeter of Bastogne. Its commander now is a young first lieutenant named Charles Boggess. The first American he meets is a paratrooper from the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion, who has not had a hot meal in 8 days. They shake hands. The siege of the 101st Airborne is over. Cobra King is the first vehicle through. Now stop and look at that gap. 48 days. In November, the tank is a smoking wreck in a Lorraine field. In December, it is leading the breakthrough that saves an airborne division. Nobody built a new tank in this 48 days. Nobody flew a replacement Sherman in from Detroit. The same physical machine, battered, perforated, written off, was hauled out of that field, dragged across France, taken apart, welded, patched, repainted, recrewed, and sent back into the worst battle of the Western Front. And what happened to Cobra King happened to 700 other tanks in that one division alone. The Germans never figured out how to do that, and it killed them. Think about what you've been told for 80 years. The Sherman was inferior. The Panther's gun outranged it. The Tiger's armor was untouchable. German engineering was the finest in the world. All of that is true. None of it is the point, because the question that decided the Western Front was not which tank was better when both were running. It was a different question. A boring question, the kind of question that does not get into the textbooks because it has nothing to do with bravery or genius and everything to do with grease, welding rods, exhausted men working under canvas at 3 a.m, and a system that turned wreckage back into weapons faster than an enemy could keep destroying them. The story you are about to hear is not about the Sherman tank. It is about the men in the second row of the photograph, the ones with the wrenches and the burned hands and the names nobody remembers. It is about why a German Panther crew in late 1944 had a worse problem than American gunfire. And it is about how an army that had been humiliated in Tunisia in February 1943 turned into a machine that, by the time it reached the Rhine, had simply broken something fundamental in the Wehrmacht's ability to wage mechanized war. To understand how that machine worked, we need to start on the other side of the line, with the Germans, because their problem is the part of this story that almost nobody tells. Part 1. The cats that ate themselves. To understand what the Americans built, you have to understand what the Germans were dealing with on the morning of any given day in 1944. And the place to start is a hot afternoon in July 1943, on the rolling steppe near a Russian town called Kursk. The Wehrmacht had spent the spring of 1943 doing something extraordinary. It had bet the entire summer offensive on a new tank, the Panzerkampfwagen 5, the Panther. On paper, the Panther was a marvel. A high-velocity 75mm gun that could kill a T-34 at 2,000 meters, sloped frontal armor that no Allied tank gun could penetrate at any sane range, a power-to-weight ratio better than any tank in Soviet service. Hitler personally delayed Operation Citadel by weeks, waiting for Panther production to deliver enough vehicles to make a difference. 200 Panthers were rushed to the front. They arrived by rail in late June. 2 of them caught fire and burned to the ground while being unloaded from the trains. Mechanical failures, fuel pump leaks pooling on the hull floor, igniting on hot exhaust manifolds. 2 tanks gone before a single Soviet soldier had laid eyes on them. The battle began on July 5th, 1943. By July 7th, 2 days in, the operational Panther count had collapsed from 184 to 40. Not destroyed, not knocked out, 40 operational. The rest were sitting in fields and roadside ditches, on the verges of forest tracks with broken final drives, seized transmissions, leaking gearboxes, and engines that had drunk their oil and quit. Some had been driven less than 100 kilometers in their entire combat lives. The crews had no idea what to do with them. The recovery vehicles assigned to support the Panther regiments numbered four for 245-ton tanks scattered across an active battlefield. By the end of July, the assessment was brutal in its honesty. Of the original 200 Panthers, 56 were burnt out total losses. 16 needed repair, so deep they had to be shipped back to Germany. 85 were sitting somewhere repairable in theory, if anyone could reach them. The numbers were so embarrassing that German tank designer Heinz Kniepkamp wrote a private memorandum admitting the Panther had been pushed into the field before it was ready. The factory rushed out modification kits. Field workshops scrambled to install new fuel pumps, new seals, new final drive housings, and it almost helped. Almost. Because the deeper problem was not engineering, it was philosophy. Albert Speer, the Reich Minister of Armaments, faced a choice every wartime production system has to face. Build new tanks or build spare parts for the tanks you already have. New hulls were celebrated. New hulls got photographed for newsreels. New hulls excited Hitler. Spare road wheels did not. The order came down to prioritize hulls. By 1944, German factories were producing a steady stream of Panthers and Tigers, and a desperate trickle of the gearboxes, final drives, and fuel pumps those tanks needed to stay alive. The result was a paradox out of black comedy. Brand new Panthers rolled off assembly lines in Saxony, while older ones sat abandoned beside roads in France because nobody could find a working final drive. By late 1944, some Panzer divisions had more tanks waiting for repair than they had operational. Cannibalization became official doctrine. Pull parts off two broken Panthers to make one running Panther, tow the empty hull off, forget about it. The numbers behind this rot are the kind that German tank historians like Thomas Jentz spent decades documenting, and they are still hard to believe. Early Panthers averaged fewer than 150 kilometers between major drivetrain failures. Roughly 5% of Panthers experienced a mechanical breakdown within their first 100 kilometers of road travel. Roughly 90% had broken down at least once by 1,500 kilometers. The Tiger II, the King Tiger, the 70-ton monster Hitler insisted on building, broke its own transmission so reliably that crews were specifically trained to baby the gearbox at all times, which is a difficult instruction to follow when somebody is shooting at you. And then there was the recovery problem, because when one of these masterpieces did break down, getting it home was a small military operation in its own right. The German solution was a vehicle called the Panther, a turretless Panther hull fitted with a winch and a spade. There were never enough of them. To recover a single broken Tiger required 2 or sometimes 3 SDKFZ 9FAMO half-tracks pulling in tandem. The FAMO was a heavy prime mover, the largest half-track the Germans built, and it was barely strong enough for the job. A single Tiger that threw a track in mud might tie up 3 FAMO crews for 2 days, with infantry security around them the whole time, because abandoning a Tiger meant Hitler's personal anger, and Hitler's personal anger killed careers. Heinz Guderian, the father of German armored doctrine, the man who literally wrote the book on panzer warfare, admitted in March 1944 that final drive, failures and transmission problems were still bedeviling the Panther force, and that crew confidence in the vehicles had collapsed in some units. By January 1945, the Panzer Commission was tracking 500 defective drives in Panzer IV units, 370 in Panther units, roughly 100 in Tiger units, and the general reporting these figures noted that crews were beginning to abandon vehicles at the first sign of mechanical trouble because they had lost faith that anything could be repaired. Field Marshal Model, one of the toughest panzer commanders Germany produced, complained that he was losing more tanks to break down on road marches than to enemy action. Post-war interviews with German officers about the Battle of the Bulge produced an estimate that 20% of any German armored column would suffer mechanical failure on a routine road move. 20%, 1 in 5, before anybody fired a shot. Compare that to the same statistic for American units operating Sherman variants on the same roads in the same winter. roughly 1%, 20 times lower. And here is the part that almost nobody outside specialist literature ever hears. The Wehrmacht was not losing this war of attrition because it was being outshot on the battlefield. It was losing it without anyone needing to fire on it. By the time a Panther actually had the chance to engage an American Sherman in direct combat, the German army had already statistically lost a fifth of its strength to its own gearboxes. The panzer divisions that conquered France in 1940 had a maintenance system built around short, sharp campaigns. By 1944, those same divisions were trying to fight a year-round mechanized war on a continent's worth of frontage with a maintenance philosophy that had not fundamentally changed since 1941. Every mile a Panther rolled, the system bled. And here is the part that should have terrified them most, if any of them had been told the full picture. The Americans they were facing, the same Americans the Wehrmacht had laughed at in February 1943 at Kasserine Pass, the Americans' German intelligence had labeled Britain's Italians, were operating an entirely different system, a system built around the brutal assumption that tanks were going to break, get hit, get burned, and get knocked out, and the only question that mattered was how fast you could turn the wreckage back into a fighting vehicle. The Germans had built the finest tanks in the world and a maintenance system that could not keep them alive. The Americans had built a mediocre tank and a maintenance system that could not be killed. And in the autumn of 1944, those two philosophies were about to collide on the same battlefield. One of them was already bleeding to death. The other was about to be tested in ways nobody had imagined. Part 2. The system that refused to die. In June 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor, a 23-year-old engineering student named Belton Youngblood Cooper received a telegram from the Secretary of War. Cooper had grown up in Huntsville, Alabama, gone to the Virginia Military Institute, transferred to the University of Michigan to study marine architecture because he wanted to design unsinkable battleships. And accidentally, through a paperwork tangle involving his old ROTC commission, gotten himself ordered to active duty with an organization he had never heard of. The 18th Armored Ordnance Battalion, 3rd Armored Division, Camp Polk, Louisiana. Report by June 22nd, 1941. Cooper was annoyed. He had no interest in tanks. He told friends that the War Department had clearly made a clerical error and that the situation would be sorted out within a year. It was not. Cooper would spend the next 5 years of his life as one of 3 ordnance liaison officers in one of the most punished armored divisions in the United States Army, present for the recovery and repair of more battle-damaged American tanks than almost any other living human being. In 1998, he would write a book about it called Death Traps that would become one of the most quoted memoirs of the entire European campaign, quoted often by the same historians who never talk about what his job actually was. Cooper's job was to drive forward its first light each day with combat units, watch what happened, identify the tanks that were knocked out, mark them for recovery, sort the repairable from the burnt out, and at night carry the combat loss reports back to the maintenance battalion headquarters, 30 to 50 miles to the rear. The reports could not go by radio. They contained too much information about American strength and damage. They had to be hand-carried in a wooden box in the back of a Jeep, accompanied by a thermite grenade Cooper was instructed to set off if the Jeep was ambushed. Cooper made these runs almost every night, often through territory that had been bypassed by the spearheads. The combat troops called it the Void. This was the front edge of a system of maintenance that the United States Army had spent 2 years building and that had no parallel in the German military. The Americans called it the 5 echelon system. Each echelon was a layer of capability. Each layer handled a more complex repair than the one below it. Each layer was staffed and equipped to keep the layer below it from being overwhelmed. First echelon maintenance was the crew, 5 men in a Sherman, plus the assistant drivers and bow gunners. The 8,200 drivers in a heavy armored division like Cooper's 3rd were responsible for fueling, lubrication, oil checks, simple cleaning, track tensioning, anything that did not require pulling a major part. They learned this work in basic training and reinforced it every single day in the field. A Sherman crew that did its first echelon maintenance properly might catch a developing problem before it became a breakdown. A crew that did not would be punished by the maintenance sergeant the next morning. Second echelon was the company maintenance section, a half-track, an M32 tank recovery vehicle, 2 armorers, 2 tank mechanics, a motor sergeant, a radio repairman. These men handled spark plug changes, simple electrical repairs, track replacements, minor weapon maintenance. They lived with the tank companies. They knew every vehicle in the unit by name and quirk. When a Sherman threw a track in a hedgerow, the second echelon section was on it within an hour, often working under enemy artillery. Third echelon was the battalion or regimental maintenance company. 50 to 100 men with a workshop truck, a wrecker, more tank recovery vehicles, machine tools, and the authority to swap out engines, transmissions, and major assemblies. A Sherman with a blown radial engine would go to third echelon. The mechanics there could remove and replace an entire engine in a Sherman in roughly 4 hours. The vehicle that left their workshop in the morning was, for practical purposes, a different machine than the one that had come in the night before. Fourth echelon was the Division Ordnance Battalion, Cooper's home unit. More than 1,000 specialized mechanics, machinists, welders, electricians, gunsmiths, and recovery crews. They could do anything short of a complete factory rebuild. They had lathes, they had heavy presses, they had parts in industrial quantities. They could fabricate components from scratch when supply could not deliver them. They were, for practical purposes, a small mobile factory that traveled with the division. Fifth echelon, base shop maintenance, was the Army-level depot. Total rebuilds, hulls reworked, turrets rewelded. Vehicles that had been catastrophic losses were sometimes brought back from the fifth echelon as if from the dead, with new engines, new transmissions, new gun mounts, new everything except the basic hull casting that gave them their identity. Now hold all 5 of those layers in your head and look at the German system across the line. The Wehrmacht had its own version of echelon maintenance, the Werkstattzüge at battalion level, the Werkstattkompagnen at division level, depots in the rear. On paper, the structures look similar. In practice, the German system was strangling on 3 things at once. A chronic spare parts shortage caused by Hitler's prioritization of new production, the increasing destruction of rail lines and factories by Allied air power, and a recovery vehicle fleet that could not begin to match the workload because Germany had never built enough Panthers and Famos to support the tanks they kept fielding. The American 5-echelon system was being fed by a logistics tail that ran from Detroit to a beach in Normandy to a forward maintenance company 3 miles behind the front line. The German system was being asked to fight winter, mud, air attack, and its own factory's refusal to produce gearboxes, all at the same time. And the difference showed in one single statistic that historians of the 3rd Armored Division still quote because nothing else captures it as bluntly. The 3rd Armored Division entered the European campaign in Normandy with an authorized strength of 232 M4 Sherman medium tanks. By the end of the war, in May 1945, the division had lost 648 Shermans completely destroyed, burned out, blown apart, total losses. And in the same period, the division had had another 700 Shermans knocked out, recovered, repaired, and put back into combat, sometimes more than once. Some tanks were knocked out and recovered 3 separate times before they finally gave up the ghost. Added up, the division replaced its entire Sherman strength roughly 5.5 times over the course of the campaign, and a substantial portion of those replacements were not new vehicles from the rear. They were resurrected vehicles. Same hull, new everything else. Cooper later called it the loss rate of 580%. He meant it as a damning indictment of the Sherman. Read it the other way, and it is also the highest compliment ever paid to a maintenance system. No army in history had ever absorbed losses like that and remained combat effective. The 3rd Armored did, week after week, all the way to the Elbe. But statistics on a page do not capture what the system looked like to the men who actually ran it. For that, you have to picture a vehicle collecting point in Normandy in July 1944. The first VCP that Cooper helped establish was near a village called Erel, not far from St. Lo. As tanks were knocked out in the bocage, recovery teams from the maintenance battalion went forward, hooked the wrecks to M32 tow vehicles, and dragged them back to the VCP. There, the work began. Cooper described what they found inside those tanks in language that does not appear in the comfortable histories. Blood, gore, body parts. The remains of crews who had been hit while their tank was buttoned up. Mechanics had to crawl into those compartments and clean them out before any repair work could begin. They used strong detergents and disinfectants. They turned over personal effects and identification tags to Graves registration. And then they started the welding torches and got to work. A tank that arrived at the VCP at noon as a charnel house could leave by sundown the next day as a fighting vehicle. Cooper, who saw this happen hundreds of times, never got used to it. The men doing the work were, for the most part, not professional soldiers. They were farm boys from Iowa and Nebraska who had spent their teenage years fixing tractors and combine harvesters because their fathers could not afford to send the equipment out for repair. They were automobile mechanics from Detroit and Cleveland who had been turning wrenches on Buicks and Fords before Pearl Harbor. They were welders from Pittsburgh shipyards. They were industrial machinists from textile mills in Massachusetts. The American draft had pulled in a uniform an entire generation of men who had grown up taking machinery apart with their bare hands during the Depression, because there was no money to do anything else. They knew engines the way German aristocrat panzer officers knew dressage horses, and the Army had figured out, somewhere between Kasserine Pass and D-Day, that this was a national resource. They sorted those men into ordnance battalions. They gave them the tools, they gave them the parts, they gave them the doctrine, and then they let them work. Men like Belton Cooper did not fight for medals. He never asked for one. He was a young lieutenant who happened to find himself in the middle of one of the great unsung industrial accomplishments of the 20th century, and what he wanted, more than anything else, was for the mechanics he served alongside to be remembered. Every like on this video keeps that name visible a little longer. Not the generals on the monuments. The sergeant nobody put a monument to. This is the system on paper. 5 echelons. 8,000 drivers doing first echelon. 2,000 specialized mechanics across the higher levels. A division of 18,000 men in which roughly 1 in 9 was a maintenance specialist. Cooper running through the void each night with his thermite grenade. M32 tow vehicles dragging burnt hulls out of Normandy fields. On December 17th, 1944, that system was about to be tested in a way nobody had planned for. Because the Germans were about to throw their last serious offensive of the war into the Ardennes, and the men who would be asked to stop them in the first hours were not seasoned tank crews from veteran divisions. They were a battalion of tankers without tanks, standing in the snow in front of an empty depot, with Joachim Peiper's panzers 8 kilometers away and closing. Part 3. The night the wrenches stopped a panzer division. On the morning of December 17th, 1944, the 744th Tank Battalion was sitting in a rest area near Stumont, Belgium, waiting for tanks. They had been on the continent for about 6 weeks. They had trained in the United States with experimental canal defense light Shermans, strange vehicles fitted with massive carbon arc spotlights for night fighting, and the Army had decided not to use them. So the battalion had been broken up, retrained on conventional Shermans, and sent to Europe as a replacement formation. They had men, they had officers, they had a battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel George K. Rubel, a wiry 40-something professional soldier from Phoenix, Arizona, who had fought in North Africa and was widely considered one of the best tank trainers in the Army. They did not have tanks. The German offensive in the Ardennes had been underway for 24 hours. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, commanding Kampfgruppe Peiper, the spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, was racing through the American lines with one mission: reach the Meuse River and split the Allied front. He had Tigers, Panthers, and Panzer Grenadiers. He had already overrun several American positions. On the morning of December 17th, he was 8 kilometers from a critical road junction at Stumont. If he reached it, he would have a clear run to the river. If he reached the river, the Allied campaign in the West might come apart. The American command needed somebody, anybody, to slow Peiper down. They looked at the map, and they found the 740th Tank Battalion sitting in Stumont. A tank battalion without tanks. Better than nothing. Lieutenant Colonel Rubel was given orders that afternoon. Get vehicles, any vehicles, and get them to Stumont. Now, Rubel and a group of his men, including most of the battalion's mechanics, drove to a nearby ordnance depot. What they found there was, in the words of the men who saw it, a graveyard. The depot held 25 armored vehicles. Most of them had been damaged in combat earlier in the autumn, hauled to the rear, stripped for parts to keep other tanks running, and abandoned. 3 of the vehicles were technically on the ready for issue line. None of those 3 had a complete radio. None had a complete tool set. None carried a full load of ammunition. The other 22 were a mix of Shermans of every type, old gasoline-engined M4s, newer M4A3s, a duplex drive amphibious Sherman with a missing breech block, an M36 tank destroyer, even a few vehicles with British radios and British markings. Some had no tracks. Some had no main guns. Some had no engines. Private First Class Harry Miller of Columbus, Ohio, was one of the men Rubel brought to the depot. Miller was a teenager. He had lied about his age and enlisted at 15. By December 17th, he'd been overseas for less than 3 months. He would later tell interviewers that his hands were so cold and so covered in grease that he could not feel them. He worked through the entire night of December 17th and into the morning of December 18th. So did the rest of the battalion's mechanics. Staff Sergeant Charlie Loopy ended up assigned to the M36 tank destroyer. Sergeant John A. Thompson drew the duplex drive Sherman with the missing breech block. And somehow, somewhere in that depot, his crew found a breech block from another vehicle and got it installed. They looted spare radios, they scrounged track links, they stripped working machine guns off vehicles too damaged to move and bolted them onto the vehicles they could move. They cannibalized the cannibalized. They built fighting tanks out of pieces of fighting tanks. By dawn on December 18th, Rubel's mechanics had 3 Shermans and 1 M36 tank destroyer running. 3, not 300, not 30. 3 Shermans and a tank destroyer against the spearhead of an SS Panzer division that had been ripping through American lines for 2 days. The 4 vehicles rolled out of the depot at first light and headed for Stumont. Lieutenant Colonel Rubel went with them. The mechanics who had built them stayed at the depot trying to get a 5th and a 6th vehicle running. The radios in the 4 lead vehicles were not properly tuned to each other. The crews had not trained together. Some of the men had never fired the gun in the tank they were now commanding. Several of the tanks did not have the correct ammunition for the gun they carried. They reached the outskirts of Stumont in the late morning of December 19th. The terrain around the village was a tactical nightmare for tanks. A long, narrow valley with a road squeezed between cliffs and a railway embankment. Visibility was poor. The fog and snow made it worse. The lead element of Kampfgruppe Piper was already in the village. 3rd Platoon, under 1st Lieutenant Charles D. Powers, was given the lead. Powers stood up in his turret as his Sherman crawled forward through the murk, his machine gunners hosing every patch of brush and shadow. He knew exactly what he was fighting. Panthers. Panthers with frontal armor he could not penetrate at any range that mattered. Panthers crewed by men who had been in combat for years. The only thing that would save him was firing first. Around a curve near Stumont Station, Powers saw his first target. A panther, camouflaged with brush, parked roughly 100 yards away, half hidden, partially covered, almost certainly setting up an ambush of its own. Powers' gunner, Corporal Jack D. Ashby, fired 1 round. The shot struck the gun mantle of the panther, deflected downward, punched through the thinner steel above the driver's compartment, and ignited the interior. The panther began to burn. Powers' tank kept moving. Less than a minute later, Ashby spotted a second panther. He fired again. This time the round ricocheted off the lower glacis plate and went into the fighting compartment. 2 panthers, killed in 2 shots by a tank crew that had built itself out of spare parts 24 hours earlier. The 3rd Sherman in the column engaged a 3rd German tank and destroyed it. The M36 tank destroyer killed a 4th. Within roughly 30 minutes of their first contact with Kampfgruppe Piper, the cobbled-together vehicles of the 740th Tank Battalion had knocked out 3 Panthers and an armored car. The lead element of one of the most feared formations in the German army had been stopped cold on a narrow road by 4 vehicles that, the night before, had been parts catalogs. Piper's column, blocked, began to back up. The narrow road did not allow for tactical maneuver. American reinforcements began arriving. By the end of the day, the spearhead of Kampfgruppe Piper at Stumont was no longer advancing. Within 72 hours, Piper would be cut off from his fuel supply. Within a week, the entire Kampfgruppe would be destroyed as a fighting force, with Piper himself escaping on foot. Now think carefully about what just happened. A German panzer commander on the morning of December 19th was looking at the map and seeing what he believed was an open road to the Meuse. He had Panthers. He had crews trained on those Panthers. He had air defense. He had infantry support. He had momentum. And he was stopped in the first 30 minutes of contact by Sherman tanks that had been assembled overnight by exhausted mechanics in a parts depot 8 kilometers behind the line. The German tanks were better. The German crews were more experienced. None of it mattered, because the American maintenance system had done something the German system could not have done in any 24-hour window, anywhere in the war. It had taken wreckage and turned it back into combat power inside the time it took for a battlefield situation to develop. Private First Class. Harry Miller would survive the war. He served 22 more years in the Army and Air Force, fought in Korea, served in Vietnam with Strategic Air Command, retired quietly. He never claimed to have done anything special. He told an Army interviewer in 2016 that on the morning of December 18th, 1944, he was just a cold, tired 16-year-old with greasy hands trying to make a tank work. The historians who write about the Battle of the Bulge mention the 740th Tank Battalion in passing, if at all. Miller's name almost never appears, but here is what should have terrified the Wehrmacht about Stumont, the part Piper himself probably never understood. The Americans had not stopped him with brilliant tanks. They had not stopped him with overwhelming numbers. They had stopped him with a maintenance philosophy, with the assumption, built into every layer of the 5-echelon system, that a knocked-out tank was not a dead tank, that a depot full of cannibalized hulks was not a graveyard but a parts library. The Germans had built tanks. The Americans had built a culture. And in the snow outside Stumont on December 19th, 1944, the culture won. Stumont was an extreme case, but what made the American system genuinely terrifying was not the extreme cases. It was the boring, daily, ordinary cases. Day in, day out, Sherman tanks were being knocked out, recovered, repaired, and reissued at a rate that made the entire German concept of attrition warfare obsolete. To understand how that worked at scale, we need to follow a particular ordnance lieutenant on his nightly run through the void. Part 4. The Void, the Wrenches, and the Math That Killed an Army. Belton Cooper made his nightly runs almost every evening from June 1944 until the end of the war. The pattern rarely varied. The combat command would finish its day's fighting somewhere west of wherever it had started, and Cooper would spend the late afternoon walking the battlefield, identifying knocked-out American tanks, marking them with numbered tags, photographing the damage when he had film, and writing down everything he could see about each loss. The make and model of the vehicle, where it had been hit, whether the crew had escaped, whether the engine compartment had burned, whether the turret was salvageable, whether it could be towed or had to be cut up for scrap. After dark, after the spearhead units had stopped for the night, he and his driver would climb into a Jeep with the windshield folded down and an angle iron wire cutter mounted on the front bumper. The wire cutter was for the German infiltration teams that liked to string piano wire across roads at neck height to decapitate American Jeep crews. In the back of the Jeep was a wooden box containing the day's combat loss reports. Beside the box was a single thermite grenade. Cooper's standing orders were that if he were ambushed, he was to pull the pin on the grenade and burn the reports before German hands could touch them. The reports contained too much information about American strength, replacement rates, repair priorities, and tactical losses for any other procedure to be acceptable. The void was the strip of countryside between the spearhead units and the trailing infantry. Sometimes it was 5 miles wide, sometimes it was 50. The American armored advance had a habit of bypassing pockets of German resistance, leaving them to be mopped up by infantry coming behind, which meant that any given stretch of road in the void might contain anywhere from 0 to several hundred Germans who had not been told the war was leaving them behind. Cooper drove through this strip at night, alone except for his driver, with no escort, with the headlights blacked out, with a thermite grenade in his lap for the better part of a year. He survived. Many other ordnance liaison officers did not. The reason any of this was worth doing, the reason a junior lieutenant was being asked to risk his life every night to deliver paperwork, was that the maintenance battalion 30 miles to the rear could not function without those reports. The sergeants and officers there needed to know, by the morning, exactly which tanks needed recovery, what the damage looked like, what parts to pull from the depot and load onto the trucks heading forward at first light. The system was a logistics machine that ran on nightly information. Without Cooper's runs, the wrong parts would arrive in the wrong places. Recovery vehicles would waste fuel chasing tanks that were too burned to recover, and the next morning's combat strength would be a guess instead of a number. The void was not optional. The void was the central nervous system of the entire repair operation, and the operation itself, when you stand back and look at it, was simply enormous. Take that one division, Cooper's 3rd Armored. By mid-December 1944, the 3rd Armored Division was operating roughly 1,800 combat vehicles and 2,300 wheeled vehicles. Inside the maintenance battalion alone, there were more than 1,000 specialized mechanics. Inside the armored regiments, there were another 1,000 maintenance personnel. Inside the various supporting units, there were hundreds more. And then there were the 8,200 drivers and assistant drivers performing first echelon work on their own vehicles. Out of an authorized division, strength of roughly 15,000 men, somewhere close to 2,000 were doing nothing but maintenance, recovery, and repair. Another 8,000 were doing it part-time as part of their daily routine. More than half the division existed to keep the other half fighting. Compare that to the German side one more time. A standard 1944 Panzer division had a single workshop company at division level, several smaller workshop platoons attached to battalions, and a handful of recovery vehicles. Total maintenance manpower was a fraction of what an American armored division fielded. By late 1944, it was being run by older men, by recovered wounded, by specialists pulled from civilian factories that had been bombed flat. The Americans had built a maintenance army inside their tank army. The Germans had built a tank army with maintenance attached. Now look at the workshop itself, a typical 3rd Armored Division vehicle. Collecting point in the autumn of 1944 was a cluster of canvas shelters in a field, ringed with anti-aircraft guns, lit at night by hooded lamps and the glow of acetylene torches. Sherman hulls in various states of repair stood in rows. Engines hung on chain hoists. Workbenches groaned under the weight of cylinder heads, transmissions, fuel pumps, machine guns, radios. Mechanics worked in teams of 4 and 5. Often through the night, often in the rain, often within range of German artillery. The Continental R-975 radial engine in a standard Sherman could be removed and replaced in approximately 4 hours by a competent crew. The Ford GAAV-8 in the M4A3 took about the same. A new transmission could go in a Sherman in roughly the same time. Hatches could be welded shut over hits, and the welds ground smooth in an afternoon. Tank guns could be unbolted and replaced with another gun pulled from a wrecked vehicle. The cumulative effect was that a Sherman knocked out on Monday could be in action again by Friday, sometimes by Wednesday. The recovery vehicles that fed the workshops were themselves a small marvel. The M32 tank recovery vehicle was a Sherman hull with the turret removed, replaced by a fixed superstructure mounting a 30-ton winch, an 18-foot A-frame boom, an 81mm mortar for laying smoke during emergency retreats, and enough armor to operate close to the front. By the end of 1944, more than 1,000 had been built. Total wartime production reached over 1,500. Every American tank battalion in Europe had M32s organic to its maintenance section. Compare that, one more time, to the German Bergepanther, produced in numbers measured in low hundreds and never coming close to meeting the demand of the units that needed it. The Germans never grasped this. Their post-war historians would write at length about American material superiority and how the U.S. Army had simply drowned the Wehrmacht in numbers. There is some truth in that. 49,200 Shermans were built during the war, against 6,000 Panthers and roughly 1,800 Tigers and Tiger IIs combined. But even those production figures understate what was actually happening. The 49,000 built does not include the 700 tanks that the 3rd Armored Division alone hauled off battlefields, repaired, and put back into combat. Multiply by 16 American armored divisions and dozens of independent battalions. The real American tank presence was substantially larger than the production numbers suggest, because every vehicle was, in a real sense, multiple vehicles. Its original self and the resurrected versions of it that came back from the workshops until the hull casting itself finally cracked beyond repair. If your father, your grandfather, or your uncle served in any branch during the war, in any theater, in any role, I would consider it an honor to read their story in the comments below. What unit? Where did they fight? What did they see? Especially if they served in ordnance and maintenance and recovery and supply, the men who never made it into the famous photographs, but without whom the famous photographs would never have happened. The official records preserve dates and unit designations. Your families preserve the rest. Those details deserve to live somewhere, and the comment section of this video is as good a place as any. By the early days of December 1944, the entire system, the void runs, the VCPs, the M32s, the 5 echelons, the 1,800 vehicles per division, the mechanics from Iowa and Pittsburgh, was running smoothly enough that nobody at higher headquarters thought much about it. It was background noise. It was the thing that always worked. And then, on December 16th, Hitler launched the largest German offensive on the Western Front since 1940. The system that had been background noise for 6 months suddenly had to do something nobody had ever planned for it to do. Part 5. Cobra King returns. On December 19th, 1944, 3 days into the German offensive, General Dwight Eisenhower called an emergency conference at Verdun. The 101st Airborne was surrounded at Bastogne. The American line was bending. Eisenhower asked his generals what they could do. George Patton, commanding the 3rd Army on the Saar front, hundreds of miles from where the German offensive was happening, stood up and said he could disengage 3 divisions from active combat, turn them 90 degrees, march them north through ice and snow, and attack the German southern flank within 48 hours. The room went quiet. What Patton was proposing was, in conventional military terms, impossible. Disengaging from combat is one of the hardest maneuvers any army can perform. Doing it with 3 divisions simultaneously is harder. Doing it in winter, while reorienting more than 100,000 vehicles 90 degrees onto a new axis of advance, is harder still. Eisenhower stared at Patton for a long moment and approved the plan. What Patton did over the next 3 days became the stuff of military legend. More than 133,000 vehicles were turned. 62,000 tons of supplies were redirected. The 4th Armored Division covered 150 miles in 19 hours. Tanks broke down on the icy roads and were pushed into the ditches by the columns coming up behind them. Crews drove without sleep, and through all of it, the maintenance battalions followed the columns north. M32 recovery vehicles dragged broken tanks off the shoulders. Mechanics fixed what they could in the open, in snow, by lantern light. Nothing stopped. The march did not stop. On December 26th, the 4th Armored Division reached the southern outskirts of Bastogne. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion at the spearhead, had begun the operation with about 50 operational tanks. By December 26th, he had 20. The rest had been knocked out by German anti-tank guns or had broken down on the icy roads or had been left behind for the maintenance crews to recover. Abrams was tired. His men were tired. The 101st Airborne inside Bastogne had been holding for 10 days against everything the Germans could throw at them. The relief had to happen now, or it would not happen at all. Abrams looked at his 20 tanks. He looked at the village of Assenois between him and Bastogne. He turned to First Lieutenant Charles Boggess of Company C, 37th Tank Battalion. Boggess was commanding a tank that had been knocked out in France in November, repaired, recrewed several times, and now under his command since just 3 days earlier, when the previous commander had been killed by a sniper. The same tank Belton Cooper's brothers in the maintenance trade might have written a combat loss report on 6 weeks earlier, except that the tank had not stayed lost. It was an M4A3E2 jumbo Sherman with thicker frontal armor, painted with the chalk legend "First in Bastogne" on its hull. Its name, given by an earlier crew, was Cobra King. Abrams gave the order. "We're going into those people now. Let her roll." Cobra King led the column. Behind her came 8 more Shermans and a half-track. American artillery, 2,340 rounds from 13 battalions, opened fire on Assinois in 8 minutes of concentrated bombardment that left the German defenders too stunned to react. Cobra King and the column behind her drove through the village without stopping. Boggess fired his main gun at any building that might contain Germans. The half-track in the middle of the column took a direct hit from a Panzerfaust and exploded, separating the column briefly. Boggess kept moving. At 10 minutes to 5 in the afternoon of December 26th, Cobra King rolled across the perimeter of Bastogne. The first American Boggess saw was 2nd Lieutenant Dwayne Webster of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion. Boggess opened the commander's hatch and called down, "How are you?" Webster walked up to the tank, stuck out his hand and said, "Glad to see you." The siege was over. The 101st Airborne had been relieved, and the tank that did it, the physical machine that made the moment happen, was the same tank that had been a smoking wreck in a Lorraine field 8 weeks earlier. Same hull, same casting numbers in the steel. The mechanics of the maintenance battalions had pulled her out of the field, dragged her back, taken her apart, fixed her, painted her, fed her into a new crew, and sent her north into the worst winter battle of the European theater, and she had arrived in time to be the first tank into Bastogne. Cobra King today sits in the National Museum of the United States Army at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. You can walk up and put your hand on her. The hull casting is still there. The same one Belton Cooper would have inspected in November 1944. The same one Private First Class Harry Miller's older brothers in the maintenance trade welded back together. A physical artifact that connects everything that matters about how the United States Army actually won the Western Front. This is the verdict. The Wehrmacht was not defeated by superior American tanks. The Sherman never became the equal of a Panther in a head-to-head fight. German engineering remained brilliant to the end. None of that mattered in the long run, because the German system had been built around the assumption that tanks were precious instruments to be carefully preserved, while the American system had been built around the assumption that tanks were going to die in batches, and the only thing that mattered was how fast you could turn the dead ones back into living ones. The Germans built tanks like watches. The Americans built tanks like a river that the Wehrmacht could chip pieces off of but could never dam. General Lucius Clay said it as bluntly as it can be said. We were never able to build a tank as good as the German tank, but we made so many of them, it really did not matter. The line is famous. The line is also not quite right, because it leaves out the second half. We did not just make so many of them, we kept the ones we already had alive. The 3rd Armored Division did not lose 648 Shermans and replace them with 648 new vehicles from Detroit. It lost 648 Shermans and replaced a substantial portion of them by hauling damaged vehicles out of fields, cleaning the crew compartments of the men who had died inside them, welding shut the holes the German shells had made, dropping in new engines and new transmissions, and putting them back in front of the same German guns the next morning. Day after day, week after week, for 11 months. The names of those mechanics are mostly gone. Belton Cooper put a few of them in his book. Major Arrington, Sergeant Rayford, the men he rode with through the void. Private First Class. Harry Miller got a small newspaper write-up in 2016 because he was still alive to be interviewed. Most of the rest exist only as signatures on requisition forms and photographs of unidentified men working on engines in fields nobody recorded the location of. They were the second row of the photograph. They were the men with the wrenches. And they did something that no army in history had ever done at the scale they did it. They turned battlefield damage into combat power on a continuous industrial cycle, faster than the most engineering-obsessed army in the world could destroy them. They beat the Wehrmacht not with bravery, though they had plenty of it, and not with better tanks. They did not have those, but with a culture of relentless, unglamorous, undignified, gore-cleaning, hand-numbing, cold rain repair work. The Germans called the Americans amateurs in February 1943. By December 1944, the amateurs were the ones who had built the only mechanized army on Earth that could absorb a 580% loss rate and keep moving forward. If this account gave you something you had not been told before, do me a small favor and hit the like button. It does not help me, particularly. It helps the men in this story stay visible to people who would otherwise never hear their names. Subscribe if you want the next chapter, because the story of how American industrial culture remade the war on land is much bigger than one division and one tank. And remember, the next time you walk past Cobra King in a museum, or read about Bastogne in a textbook, or watch a film with a Sherman tank in it, that machine did not get there by itself. It got there because, somewhere behind it, in a canvas tent in a Belgian field at 3 a.m. in December 1944, a tired man from Ohio or Iowa or Pittsburgh with grease on his hands and a welding torch in his fist refused to admit that a knocked-out tank was a dead tank. The machines were American. The crews were American. But the thing that actually fixed them, the thing that put Cobra King back on the road and into Bastogne and into the history books, was a quiet, unfashionable, deeply American conviction that anything broken could be fixed if you had enough patience and enough light to see by. The Wehrmacht had no answer for that. They never did. And by the time they understood the question, the war was over.